it seemed to me that it would be foolish to try and cover 1,000 years in one day. So we're going to cover 975. So we'll do about 975 years today, and try to burn through as much of that as we can. We're going to pick up the pace a lot. Last week we did 2 years, and today 975. Our plan for our 4 weeks together, the first week we talked about the first 300 years of the church. We focused on symbols of anchors and fish. Then we talked about mysterious letters last week, and today we're going to talk about crosses and crucifixes, and we're going to pick up pretty much exactly where we left off last week and move forward over 900 years. And one of the core assumptions that we're working on is the reason we have symbols is that they speak in ways that words can't. Not necessarily better, not necessarily worse. It's not that they say things words are unable to say, but they say it in a way that words can't say it. Symbols do something differently in our memories and in our emotions than words often do. And so we've had symbols from the beginning of the church. First week we looked at symbols like this, the fish, the anchor, and then the combination of the fish wrapped around the anchor. And we talked about this acrostic that is Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. These are statements of faith about who Jesus is and that our hope is in Jesus Christ. Last week we talked about Constantine and his conversion, and this is called a Chi-Rho. The X is the Chi, and this what looks like a P is the Rho. So it's a CH and an R, the first 2 letters of the word Christ. So again, this symbol is a statement of faith, that Jesus is the Christ. Christ is the same word as Messiah or Savior. So these first symbols really have been more statements of faith than anything else. That Jesus is God's Son and Savior, that our hope is in Jesus Christ, and that Jesus is the Savior and the Messiah. So that's week 1 and week 2 very quickly. Now we're going to move on to week 3. We're going to begin talking about the cross. So where we ended last time was Constantine, who was emperor of the sort of very far western reach of the Roman Empire, which had been divided up into 4 pieces. Constantine had this strange conversion experience in the year 312, where he saw a sight and decided he was being called to go and set the Christians free from persecution and reunite the empire. And we parallel his story with the story of Moses, who saw a very strange sight and believed he was being called to set the people of God free. And in both of the stories, we ended up with a new way of looking at the name of God. With Moses, we ended up with that Hebrew word, those 4 letters. And with Constantine, we end up with the Chi-Rho as the symbol of Christianity. And eventually that Chi-Rho made its way onto coins. We looked at some of those last week. I'll pass these guys around again. These are dating to almost 400. And if you look closely on one side, you may see the Chi-Rho again. 400, 300, 400. And so shortly after Constantine's reign, the Chi-Rho made its way onto Roman coins. And then in 313, he worked together with another emperor to issue what's called the Edict of Milan, which offered a degree of protection to Christians throughout the Roman Empire. It was not explicitly for Christians, but they're the ones who chiefly benefited, and they were named in the edict. So that's where we're going to pick up our story today, and we're going to talk about Constantine's mom, who's right here. So this is a tapestry that we talked about the series that Rubens did last week, and this is another part of the series from Rubens. And Constantine is down here kneeling in front of the cross. And this is his mother, whose name is, sometimes she's called Helena, or Helena. But Helena, Constantine's mother. And there's a legend about Constantine's mother that it's told various ways throughout history. Sometimes this is at Constantine's urging. Sometimes it's at the urging of a vision or a dream that she had herself. But Helena decided it was her job, and she was being called to find the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. She wanted to find the actual piece of wood where Jesus died. And now this is happening in the 300s, so it's been several centuries. But Constantine then sent her to Jerusalem to find that cross. And sometimes it's called the true cross. So if you see people making reference to the true cross, what they mean by that is the cross on which Jesus died. So this is a series of woodcuts that were made in the 1400s as they were reproduced in the 1800s. And it's essentially a comic book about Helena looking for the true cross. And so I took only some of the key panels, but here she is. Arriving in Jerusalem and meeting with some of the chief officials and telling them of her mission. After which they dug up the location where the crosses were rumored to be buried, and they found not one, but 3 crosses. And Helena was thrilled to have found something, but her job was not to find a bunch of crosses. Her job was to find the cross on which Christ was crucified. And so we come down here, and I want you to notice, this does not look like the picture of a cross we have in our minds. The picture of a cross we have in our minds is a lowercase t. This is a capital T. There are a number of historians, particularly ancient historians, who seem to indicate the true cross may have looked more like this. The cross on which Christ was crucified may have been more of a capital T than a lowercase t. And sometimes you will see it. And so I brought some crosses from my own collection. And so this cross is, again, that kind of style, and it gets used at a lot of different situations. And in particular, when people use this cross, they'll connect it to a story about Moses in the wilderness. If you remember, there's a story where Moses is in the wilderness and the people are bitten by serpents. And Moses puts a bronze snake on a pole. And when the people look at the bronze snake, they're cured. And in artistic depictions, the pole looks like this. And so people connect that story to the crucifixion of Christ as a place of healing through crosses like this. So I'll pass this around. On most of the crosses I'm going to pass around, there are descriptions on the back. I'm going to say most of the stuff that's back here. Don't feel like you need to read it, but if you'd like to, there it is. And so you'll notice that that's the shape of this cross. So Helena finds 3 crosses, which is 2 too many, and she wants to figure out which one is the actual cross on which Christ died. And she talks to the officials, and they tell her there was a young woman nearby who was very, very sick and at the point of death. And so they took the 3 crosses to this young woman's house, and a very strange story, they took each of the 3 crosses and touched her. And when the 3rd cross touched the young woman, she jumped up out of bed, healed from her illness, so filled with energy that she started running around the house like a 5-year-old on a sugar high. And so this little girl was all of a sudden healed after she touched one of the crosses, and Helena immediately took that as a sign that this was the true cross. It was able to bring healing, it was able to prevent death. And so she took this true cross, she took it back and showed it to Constantine, which is what we see in this picture. And then she divided it into pieces and took it to important locations and built churches. One of them was there at Jerusalem, and in many cases she tore down pagan temples to build churches around these portions of the true cross. Now, this is a very, very interesting story, and we have a lot of exciting things. There's the quest, and there's the hero in the beginning, a few obstacles. We get a miracle in the middle, and the happy ending. And it sounds almost too good to be true, but it turns out this was a story that was actually circulated in the early 400s. And a historian wrote about it really in just a couple pages and said, as he concluded, the empress then, having been granted her prayer with such a clear token, poured her royal ambition into the construction of a wonderful temple on the site where she had found the cross. So this is written within 100 years of the story reportedly taking place. Now, we followed another historian through the life of Constantine, and he wrote Constantine's biography. He tells us a lot about Constantine's father and Constantine's mother. His name is Eusebius, and so I thought it would be interesting to see what Eusebius had to say about Helena finding the cross. And so to quote Eusebius, he said this: nothing. Not one single word about Helena finding the cross. And so historians have looked at this and said, now wait a minute. The exhaustive biography of Constantine says nothing about something as significant as the true cross. One of our chief sources of information about Helena never mentions this quest to find the cross. And then a very strange thing started to happen. These churches that said they had portions of the cross seemed to be multiplying. And over the years, it started to happen that lots and lots and lots of churches had pieces of the cross. And a theologian near and dear to the Presbyterians, John Calvin, actually remarked on this. And I'm going to show you a quotation, and I left it in the script that it was written in the book from the 1800s. We talked last week about how much script evolves, and you'll see this is very difficult to read even though it's in English. So from John Calvin, from the same book that reproduced those woodcuts, "To be short, if a man would gather together all that hath been found of this cross, there would be enough to freight a great ship. There were so many splinters and shards and toothpicks claiming to be part of the true cross, Calvin said you could build an ocean liner out of them." So all of a sudden, people start to cast some doubts on this story of Helena finding the cross. For one, Eusebius never mentions it, and for another, there are so many pieces of the cross, they can't all possibly be true. But I'd like for us to back up on this a second. That first argument, that Eusebius never mentions it, therefore it didn't happen, it sounds like sound logic, but it's not. If we want to step outside of our typical worlds, we've got a lot of worlds we're working in here, of history and archaeology and art and theology. Let's add one more. Let's go into logic and philosophy. To say that Eusebius never mentions it, therefore it didn't happen, is considered a fallacy. It's called an argument from silence. Any of you who are logicians or philosophers, who studied philosophy in the past, may be familiar with this. The idea that someone doesn't mention it, therefore it doesn't happen, is completely inconclusive. That's actually one possible explanation for the absence. If you stop and think about it, we could probably spend the next 45 minutes and come up with 100 different reasons that Eusebius doesn't mention this story. It could be that it was so important he planned to write another book only about that, but never got there. It could be that he did write the book and it was lost to history. It could be that he was mad that he wasn't sent to find the cross. It could be that he had questions about whether it was the right cross. It could be that he was upset with Constantine or that he was upset with Helena. It could be any number of reasons. But the fact that he doesn't mention it isn't conclusive. So it's hard to build an entire case against this legend merely by the absence of a story in one historian. And next, the fact that there are a lot of portions of the cross that seem to be dubious at best doesn't say anything about the legend itself. If you say, I have an autographed Mickey Mantle card, and I roll my eyes and say, sure, so do I might not be telling the truth, but that says nothing about whether you're telling the truth. So we have all these little things that sort of urge us to say this legend of St. Helena is nothing more than a legend, but I want to at least open the possibility that there may be more to it than that. Regardless, something very strange happened around the same time. The attitude started to change. And so we got a quote here from Galatians, "May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ." Around the time that this story of Helena starts to gain popularity, the attitudes toward the cross start to change. And we get coins. Now, this is going to be our latest coin, I think our last coin that we're going to use together. This is from around the 400s, 408 to 450, and you'll notice it's minuscule. This thing is about half the size of a dime. I'm going to pass it around. You probably won't be able to see anything on it. So I want you to see, and it's been beaten up pretty badly by the last 1600 years. But if you look really closely, as we've blown it up immensely here, there's a cross right in the center. A giant cross in the center of the coin. We don't know what happened, if Helena found the true cross or not, but something happened between the year 312 and the year 408 that now the cross itself started to appear on the official coins of the Roman Empire. For some reason, the cross which Christians had avoided made its way onto coins. So whether or not the story of Helena is true, it is absolutely true that something significant changed in the way Christians thought about crosses. Before this, the cross had been, to think about the old hymn, an emblem of suffering and shame. The cross was something on which Christians could look forward to being persecuted and killed. after Constantine, the cross started to be the subject of stories about healing and about salvation. And it started to become an emblem of Christianity even on the coins. So we go forward about another 100 years, and we get lamps that start to show crosses. And so this is a lamp where there's a very clear cross on the front. I'm going to pass this around. This is pottery, so it could break. So let's leave it in the box. If you want to take it out of the box, please keep it nearby and do not drop it. And so this is you can see a very clear cross right here on the front of the lamp. The way that these lamps tended to work, the oil would go down here and a wick would come out the sort of front, and that's where the light would come from. And so this is in the 400s to 500s, we start to see crosses showing up more and more on lamps. Remember, previously the Christians steered clear of crosses and used things more like anchors. And then we get this. This is a flask, not that kind of flask. This is a flask that was used to hold the equivalent of holy water or healing oil. And I'll pass this around. There was a man who was killed under Diocletian. We talked about the persecution under Emperor Diocletian, who is Saint Menas, and he ended up, without going too much into his story, his burial place ended up becoming an important holy site. And water or oil from his burial place was reputed to have healing properties. And so people would bottle this and distribute it for its healing abilities. The reason this story is important to us is that these flasks were molded and mass-produced. And look what's over his shoulders. Crosses. So within just 150, 200 years, we go from Christians never using the cross to mass-producing crosses in molds. This is a tremendous shift in just a few generations. Something that was an emblem of death becoming an emblem of healing and of salvation. The mass production is really important with this particular artifact because they used it so often. We also have another artifact here, a handle. This is from a church site from around the 500s, and it would have been a handle of a jug of some sort. And you can see very clearly it's a cross. And so again, we start to see the cross showing up not just on lamps or on coins, but on all kinds of different objects that were used both in churches and in homes. And also from that site, we also have a piece of window glass. I'll pass this around. It's kind of interesting. It's colored and kind of a beautiful shade. But so that's glass from the same church from the 500s. So the crosses are now starting to make their way into church sites, into homes, into personal devotional objects. And we're going to revisit an old friend as we go forward another 100 years. The anchor lamp that we talked about last time. 2 weeks ago. So again, the anchor stayed in use through all these centuries. And so here's the anchor lamp. Again, we'll leave this up here since we've seen it before. And another cross from the 600s or maybe 700s is here. This is one I'm going to walk around. You can see the cross is right there at the top. And if you look closely on either side of it, there seem to be some figures, which may be some letters. It might be an alpha and omega, the beginning and end of the alphabet. The alpha looks a lot like an A. The omega looks kind of like a horseshoe. It's hard to tell if that's what these are, but it's one possibility. And so again, you see this lamp that's got the Christian imagery and the cross on it. And as we discussed before, lamps themselves took on great symbolic significance. When people talked about Jesus as the light of the world, they would often use a lamp as a symbol for Jesus. And so as we get to this point where you've got crosses and perhaps even letters on lamps, this is really loaded. Between the lamp as a symbol of Christ, plus the cross, plus the Alpha and Omega, there are a lot of claims about who Jesus is and why Jesus is important embedded into this little piece of pottery. So by this point, we're at the 600s, the 700s, and crosses have started to make their way all over the place in a lot of different objects, even in mass production. So it really doesn't take long. Once the floodgates open, the crosses start to show up all over the place, and that I think it's important for us to remember, or at least have in the back of our minds, that a lot of times when these symbols shift, there's theology shifting as well. Remember those early images of fish and anchors? They were images of hope and salvation. When we then get to the point of Constantine and we shift to the Chi-Rho, it's an image of victory and triumph. And we're going to go through another theological shift here in just a moment to the crucifix. Now, shifting to the crucifix is always fun in a Protestant church, so we just don't know what to do with these things. And in fact, we don't even really know for sure what they are. If you ask most Presbyterians to define a crucifix, I won't put you on the spot and ask you. In my experience, Presbyterians define the crucifix as a cross with a body on it. That's a crucifix. If it doesn't have a body, it's a cross. If it does have a body, it's a crucifix. That's an accurate definition for us as Presbyterians. There are some Roman Catholics and other flavors of Catholics that would disagree with us, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the crucifix did start to appear as early as the 200s. This is an offensive image. I apologize for that. In the 200s, there was a piece of graffiti scrawled on a wall, which we discovered about 150 years ago. And if you look closely, this is a figure on a cross, but instead of a human head, he has the head of a donkey. And there's a man over here who seems to be praying or looking at this crucified figure. And the words are, Alexamenos prays to his God. This is graffiti mocking Christians and making fun of Jesus. The first sort of crucifix that we have throughout history was not used to identify Christians, but to mock them. It's kind of no wonder it took us a couple hundred years to start using crosses. So initially, the crucifix was used to persecute Christians, to deride them, to tease them. And a few hundred years later, we find this. In the intervening time, there aren't a ton of crucifixes. This is one of the earliest examples of a body on the cross, and it belonged to a queen. And it's believed that this was used not during public worship. It was not part of a church, but it was a private devotional object. It was not sanctioned by the church itself or by a pastor. It's something that a Christian wanted to use in her own prayer life. And there are some interesting things about this cross or crucifix, depending on how you want to view it. One in particular, I just want to highlight, because hopefully we'll get to this next week. The sun and the moon are up here. But down here, when you look at the body that's on the cross, there are a couple of interesting features that are worth looking at. It's believed that this is dated to the 500s. But look at the face. That's a lot like the faces we use in our pictures today. Hasn't changed a whole lot in 1,500 years. The posture is also interesting. His head is kind of tilted to one side, but it's very much held upright, and his body is straight. He's alive. When you look at this picture, the Christ on this cross is not being crucified. He looks totally fine. And we go forward to a couple hundred years. This is an Irish high cross. Has anyone been to Ireland and seen these? Yeah, they're very cool. They're huge. I haven't actually been able to see them in person. But what you see on this cross is, again, there's a body right there in the center. And again, he doesn't look to be in a whole lot of pain. Straight up and down, his head is held upright. This is a replica of the other side of that cross. I'll pass this around. If you drop this, it will break. I know that from experience. You'll see the glue on the back side. So anyway, if you look again, this is the back side, which is different. But again, Christ is right there in the center. And this is believed to be a scene of the Last Judgment. And so we see these crosses start to appear with Christ dead center on the cross. And yet, he's not dead center. He's alive and well. And we'll see. We'll see another one. This is the San Damiano crucifix or cross. This is a very famous one. Again, it's a very large cross, and it's believed to be the cross that St. Francis was looking at when he had a vision calling him into ministry. And you'll see now, at this point, right, we've gone forward about 500-600 years from the first cross with a body on it, and there are all kinds of other people floating around on this cross. And we could spend a long time talking about who they are and what their significance is, but we're going to focus on Jesus in the center this time. And again, he looks like he's doing pretty well. He's got a very peaceful, sort of tranquil look on his face. His head is, again, it's tilted, but it's held upright. His body is pretty much straight. And his hands are outstretched, but they're kind of tilted upward, almost in the same posture you might see a pastor giving a benediction. In all three of these examples, Jesus is not dying. And this is very important, because these early sort of crucifixes were not intended to be history. They were intended to be symbolic or theological. They're making a claim about who Jesus is. Just like the anchor made a claim about our hope being in Christ, like the fish made a claim about Jesus being the Son of God and Savior, just like the Chi-Rho made a claim that our victory is through Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, these images make a claim that Jesus Christ is God. Even being crucified, Jesus is in charge. He is reigning from the cross. And so throughout history, we have this sort of struggle as Christians between whether we're going to emphasize the humanity or the divinity of Jesus in our sermons and in our lessons and in our art. These early crosses tend to err on one side. They tend to emphasize divinity. This is God on the cross. They did not tend to emphasize the history. No one believed that if you could go back in time and snap a picture of the crucifixion, it looked like this. And there's a reason for that. When you put yourself in the shoes of those early disciples, what do you do when God dies? You don't sit down and write about how long his hair was, or which way his arms were crossed, or his feet were crossed. You go into hiding, and you rethink every decision you have ever made in your life. That's what the early disciples did. And then, when he appeared again, the important thing was not what his beard looked like, or how long it was, or which direction he parted his hair. The important thing is God died and God conquered death. All that other stuff is secondary. And so these early depictions aren't about which direction Jesus' hair is parted. These early depictions are a claim that this is God, and that God died, and that God conquered death. They are intended to convey theology, not history. Yes, the crucifixion is a historical event, but these pictures are trying to explain what it meant and what it means, not the specific details of what happened. That is going to be very, very important for us, especially next week. So I just want to say one more time, these early depictions, these early symbols are about theology, not history. If you disagree with me, that's totally fine, but I want to get visual confirmation that you understand what I'm saying. Okay, good. These are not history. In my view, these are about theology. And those crosses started to resurface within the last 100 years. The story of how that happened is really interesting. But let me pass this around. My son is 6 years old, and I was showing him these crosses, getting ready for the lesson this morning. And I showed him this one, and he said, "Hey, I've seen that before." I said, "Really? Where did you see it?" And he said, "Oh, I saw it at my preschool." He went to preschool at a Roman Catholic church. He said, "Yeah, there are at least 2 of those at my preschool." And he's right. I know where they are. This image has become much more popular in the last 100 years. Some people will call this a risen Christ cross because the emphasis seems to be on resurrection. This is the cross from Good Friday with Jesus from Easter Sunday, or even the Ascension. Others will call it a risen Christ crucifix because we say there's a body on there, it's a crucifix. However, Roman Catholics aren't really sure they'll call this a crucifix. Some of them, being kind of snarky, call it a resurrectifix. Because there is no crucifixion in this picture. And that ends up being one of the crucial distinctions between how we would define a crucifix and how some of our Roman Catholic friends would describe a crucifix. For us, if there's a body on a cross, it's a crucifix. But for Roman Catholics, particularly as it would be defined in their liturgy, the body has to be dying or dead. It has to depict crucifixion to be a crucifix. So this would not count as a crucifix. And there's a lot of interesting history within recent decades about whether this symbol was allowed to replace a traditional crucifix in Roman Catholic churches. And ultimately the answer kind of ended up being no. If you want to have one of these, that's great. You can put it at the back near the door. But you need to have an actual crucifix in the sanctuary as well. That's a really interesting story, and we will spare some time by not going into all the details. It also, this is another one that's become kind of popular in recent years. This is sometimes called a Christus Rex, or Christ the King. If you look on his head, he's got a great big crown, and it's not a crown of thorns. It's a king's crown. So again, this is a modern example of a way that we've taken those older images of Christ on the cross as reigning from the cross, and we've sort of updated it, and we use it today. In particular, this is interesting because of what Jesus is wearing. He's got the crown on his head, but also he's wearing priestly garments. In particular, he's wearing the robes that would be worn during communion. And so this is connecting Good Friday, connecting the death of Jesus with the celebration of communion. And the particular ways that we depict the crucifixion and our crosses end up having a lot of implications on our theology of communion. Like I said, this doesn't cut it in many Catholic churches because there needs to be a crucifix present when they celebrate the Mass. Presbyterians, we don't really think about it the same way, but we also have a much different theology of communion. And so it's interesting to see the way that our images express our theology and also kind of grow out of our theology. So, there was a major shift that was on the way. We just saw 5 examples of crosses where Jesus is depicted very heavily on the side of the divine, where he's depicted as king, where he's reigning from the cross. But as early as the 700s, there's an icon that appears in a monastery near Egypt, called the Monastery of St. Catherine. And this is what has survived of the icon. You can see a large portion of it's missing. But when you look at Jesus, something's a little bit different. In particular, the posture of his head. He's still turned to the side, but his head isn't held high. It's starting to droop. Also, his hands are starting to drop a little bit. And most notably, there's blood gushing from his side. He's dying. This is a different way to picture the crucifixion. Again, he's still pretty straight. He still seems to be very conscious. But nonetheless, I mean, when you look at the expression on his face, some of that tranquility is vanishing. And it's giving way to a look of sorrow and of pain. This is a figure that's dying. It's pretty rare to see these this early, and they start to pop up a little bit here and there, but it doesn't really gain any sort of wide mainstream acceptance for another few hundred years when we see this. This is a completely different ballgame. Look at the head. It's slumped over to the side. It's actually resting on his shoulder. His eyes are closed, and his body is twisted almost violently. The hands are raised, but not because he's raising them, because the body is hanging. This is a body that looks dead. This is not a depiction of God on the cross. This is a depiction of a man on the cross. This is one of the pictures where we start to shift from emphasizing the divinity to emphasizing the humanity of Christ. This is someone who can cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And so after this appears, these kinds of crosses start to become much more widely used. And I have, again, a replica of this. I'll pass this around. And this is just before the Renaissance that this cross appears. And so when you think about the traditional depictions that you've seen of the cross, they tend to look a little bit more like this. And again, it comes with a major theological shift. It's a shift away from emphasizing Christ as King, Christ as God, and a way to shift towards recognizing the humanity of Jesus Christ and recognizing what it means for Jesus to die. Now, when we talk about the difference between crosses and crucifixes, it's important for us to think about the sort of Protestant-Catholic dispute on this. A lot of times, if you ask a Presbyterian why there's no Jesus on the cross in their church, we will kind of puff out our chests a little bit and stand up straight and tall and say, because our Jesus is risen. And you'll talk to a Roman Catholic and say, well, then why is their body on your cross? And they'll say, because our Jesus actually died. And the Presbyterian would say, yes, but our Jesus is not on the cross anymore. And the Catholic will say, your Jesus never was. And so this is just kind of one of the places where the slight distinction in our theology can cause us to butt heads. And it's about whether you're going to emphasize the sacrifice, the death on the cross, or if you're going to emphasize the victory, the resurrection, whether you're going to focus more on Good Friday or on Easter Sunday. Ideally, it would be nice if we could stop taking shots at each other and acknowledge that these are actually both parts of all of our traditions. However, in that argument, when we get kind of snooty and say our Jesus isn't on the cross, our cross doesn't have a body, it's important for us to take a little, this is strong medicine, but a little dose of reality. We hated the uninhabited cross as early or as recently as the 1800s. In the United States, Protestants were climbing their own churches to cut down crosses that pastors put on the steeples, because we thought that the plain, empty cross was too Catholic. Within about 100 years, we've completely turned around on that and claimed the empty cross as our symbol, saying that it's always been a Protestant symbol and that the crucifix is a Catholic symbol. But in reality, it's really only been within the last 100 years or so that we've been willing to accept the empty cross as a Protestant symbol on its own. So after this point, this crucifix imagery starts to become very popular, and we start to see multiplication of these images, and they start to explode in their complexity. One thing you'll notice, even on this one, is we've got some figures on either side of Jesus. This is this on its own. When you think back to those early images of the anchors and the fish, this is so much more complicated. Right? We've got an actual human form, we've got 3 different people who are here, the geometry ends up being really important, but then as we get into the Renaissance, it's going to explode. And we're going to see all kinds of different figures in all kinds of different places. The colors are going to take on a lot of significance. And next week, what I want us to do is to shift a little bit towards those Renaissance depictions and to look at these crucifixion scenes from the Renaissance. And my goal for next week is that when we're done, I want you to be able to see these pictures and be able to articulate a little bit about what they're saying simply based on the location of the objects in the paintings. So next week we're going to look in depth at some Renaissance paintings, at the different symbols that are there, at where they appear, why they appear in those places, and try to start decoding who these figures are and what their significance is.